Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas and welcome to our weekly chair chat with the American Bar Association Civil Rights and Social Justice section, where I have the honor of serving as chair this year. And today I want to welcome as our guest, Mr. Geoffrey Strommer, who is the co-chair of our section's Native American Affairs Committee and a lead attorney on many issues regarding the Native American community across the country. And we're so happy to have you with us today, Jeff. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Jeff, as you know, this week is the week of Thanksgiving. We're also celebrating Native American Heritage Month this month in November. Could you share with our listening audience, what are the origins and the history of November being designated as Native American Heritage Month?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So the first formal designation that I'm aware of that happened was in 1990. President Bush signed into law an executive order that designated the month of November as Native American Month. And it's a chance for American Indians and people of Indian descent in this country to be able to celebrate their history, their background, teach other people about their culture. I think importantly to let everybody know that, you know, they're still very much alive and very active in our communities and in our society.
Well, thank you for sharing that history with those who may not have known that. And we do lift up the history and the story and the legacy of our Native American brothers and sisters. So we really want to thank you for sharing that and really encourage our legal community to study and learn more about our Native American brothers and sisters and that important legacy. You are a lead attorney on many issues involving the Native American community. You represent different tribes across the country. Could you kind of share with us, what are some of the leading civil rights issues that are unique or particular to the Native American community?
So the Native American community is interesting in a number of respects. There are a number of political issues. They are the third sovereign that's identified in the Constitution.
Right.
And so many of the issues that I deal with tribes exercising their sovereignty and the relationship that they have with states and the federal government as a byproduct of exercising their sovereignty and how they fit within kind of the family of sovereigns under the Constitution.
Right.
Having said that, they share, I think, to some degree, very much the same kinds of civil rights issues that other minority populations in this country have. There are voting rights problems that affect Native American communities to the same degree, and in some parts of the country, very much worse than other minorities face, you know, in their parts of the country. So those kinds of issues and racial profiling are also a problem in some parts of the country. So those kinds of problems are also very much problems that affect American Indian communities. But on top of it, they have this layer of complexity associated with their political status that most other minorities, or well, no other minority group in the United States has. So it's kind of an interesting and complicated landscape that is in some respects different than many minorities, but in some respects very much the same.
Well, speaking to that, you recently wrote an amicus brief in the Brackeen case that was argued recently, earlier this month, before the Supreme Court. And I understand that you were also there for the oral arguments before the Supreme Court. Could you share with us what that case is about and why it's important in the context of civil rights and social justice?
Yeah, I'm happy to. At first, though, let me say that I was very proud to be able to file the amicus brief on behalf of the American Bar Association in the case. It's the first time that the American Bar Association has filed an amicus brief in any Indian case. So I hope it's not the last, because there are a lot of very important Indian cases out there.
Right.
The Brackeen case is a case that presents, to some degree, an existential threat to the foundation of Indian law as we know it today. The foundation of Indian law is based on the political relationship between the United States and federally recognized tribes. And there has been for 200 years a recognition that Congress has plenary power to enact laws that are a direct relationship to that unique status, political status. And the courts, the Supreme Court included, has reviewed those laws when they've been challenged under a form of a rational basis test. Is this law rationally connected to the unique political status of Indian tribes? In the Brackeen case, the law at issue being challenged here is the Indian Child Welfare Act,
Right.
which was enacted in the late 70s. And the act was enacted by Congress to try to solve really a problem related to genocidal tendencies of our society, in which Indian children were taken away from Indian families
Right.
and adopted out wholesale to non-Indian families, and essentially deculturizing those children and stealing children from the tribal communities from where they came. The problem was recognized in the 1970s. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted by Congress based on the political relationship, and it imposes on child adoption agencies throughout the country certain priorities that are tied to tribal communities. And if the child to be adopted is an Indian child, then the statute requires that tribes be given a role in the adoption process that includes a preferential role, if they choose to take it, to have the child placed in an Indian family. It's being challenged on equal protection grounds. So the states and the individual who are challenging the statute want the court to start applying, an entirely different test to
Right.
A race-based kind of test to the statute itself. If the court were to adopt that approach, there are literally dozens of federal laws that have been passed by Congress that were passed based on the political relationship that would see their underpinnings pulled away from under them, because they were based on the political relationship, and they have survived in some cases challenges based on the rational basis test that applies to those laws. So it's not an overstatement to say that if the plaintiff's position in this litigation is adopted by the court, that it would be an existential threat to the legal construct that currently exists and has existed for many, many years in Indian country.
I know it's not exactly the same, but in your sense, do you see this case similarly, or in some context in the same family of the affirmative action cases that they're also hearing, the Harvard and the North Carolina case? Is there some connectivity?
It's an interesting question, because the oral argument on the affirmative action cases happened the week before Brackeen was arguing. And it was clear to me, sitting in the courtroom listening to the argument, that a number of the arguments that were being raised by some of the more conservative justices on the bench were directly tied to the affirmative action cases, because they framed their questions, I think, probably identically to how they were framing questions in the affirmative action cases. So there definitely, I think, in the minds of some of the justices, is a direct linkage between the two. There are some, though, that recognize and understand. Judge Gorsuch, for example, has been a very strong supporter, because he understands federal Indian law very well. And he understands the distinction between how the affirmative action cases are treated and how the political relationship basis of Indian law differs and should be treated differently by the court. But there definitely was kind of a feeling that they had walked out of the affirmative action argument, some of them, and were carrying on that conversation in a very different context.
I can see that. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you have a sense of how Supreme Court may rule on this case?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, if I were counting heads, I think it's going to be a very close vote if they decide to get into the merits. There are, they could decide based on standing and dismiss the case. So I don't even want to speculate.
Okay, I understand. Well, let me ask you this. You've touched on some of this already, but as you know, the theme of this year for our section is economic justice. Could you highlight some of the economic justice issues that are particularly unique to the Native American community that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, most Americans, I think, at this point in time, are a little bit confused about what Indian country is. You've got, on the one end of the spectrum, stories about casinos and gaming that is taking place in Indian communities, and some tribes have done very well in that space in different parts of the country. But the vast majority of tribes are in very remote areas. I mean, if you look to tribes up in the Dakotas, the unemployment rate that exists in some of those communities is just staggering, 80–85%. I mean, there's very little economic activity in those communities. So same in remote parts of Alaska, for example. So the more rural the communities are, the more the challenges are. But Indian country definitely has a long way to come to develop their economies so that they're kind of on par with the majority or the median of economies of local communities outside of the Indian community. And they face all the challenges of trying to build up those economies.
Do you have any thoughts on solutions?
Well, you know, over the years, there have been a number of different attempts at solving these problems. One of what I think has been one of the most successful is the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, which is a statute that was enacted in the late 70s. It allows tribes to step into the shoes and take over programs from the federal government, which are provided to Indian people based on treaty responsibilities and the trust relationship. And that statute has allowed many tribes to develop capacity to govern and to administer programs. And in many cases, it has served as a platform for them to move on and develop their economies as a byproduct of that. So I think that's been really kind of an anchor statute, and the concept of helping build capacity, governmental as well as administrative, to be able to move into areas of more active economic development. And gaming and economic development is happening in some parts of Indian country. I don't mean to, you know, minimize the fact that there are some real successes out there, but it's very challenging, particularly for some parts of the country, and the more rural parts, the more challenging it is.
Well, as you well know, one of the leaders and heroes in the Native American community who's been trying to find solutions and fight for solutions is John Echohawk, who we are honoring this year with the 2023 Thurgood Marshall Award. I wonder if you could share some thoughts you may have on Mr. Echohawk's work. I'm sure you know him and have worked with him in the past. As we honor him in 2023 at our annual meeting, what do you want our listening audience to know about him?
Well, I do know John. I know John well. He founded the Native American Rights Fund 50 years ago. This year was that organization's 50th anniversary. My law firm is just a weekend or so ago celebrated its 40th anniversary. And so our paths have crossed his for many years. He is one of the genuine heroes, I think, in the legal profession in Indian country. There's no question about it. He has elevated involvement of highly skilled lawyers representing Indian tribes on a whole range of issues, and done so just extraordinarily well. The group of lawyers at NARF are absolutely excellent lawyers across the board, and they have been, you know, for the 50 years that the organization has been in place. And they have a record of good decisions on foundational and really important cases in a whole range of different spaces in Indian country. From water law to trust responsibility to voting rights. I mean, the list goes on and on. So they have really contributed enormously to this field. And I think John and David Getches, who co-founded NARF with them, both bear a tremendous amount of the responsibility and the plaudits for the success of the organization.
We're really excited to be honoring John this year, and we hope that you and your firm will join us and participate in the celebration next summer.
Oh, I'll be there for sure.
Great. One thing that we want to do with this chair chat is offer information and resources to our members and the broader ABA community around ways they can be involved or be supportive or learn more about our civil rights and social justice issues. Are there particular resources that you would point us to, or websites, or even books or magazines that we could read or study to learn more about Native American issues, particularly in the context of helping push their civil rights agenda?
Yeah, our section has a number of resources that I recommend people access. There are a lot of organizations in the country that are national organizations that represent tribal rights. NARF is one that focuses on legal issues, but the National Congress of American Indians, the National Indian Health Board, and a variety of other organizations of that nature have a tremendous amount of materials on their websites. I mean, one thing that I think the legal community really ought to focus on, if I can just put a little plug in.
Please, yes.
There's an incredibly good crop of young Indian lawyers who are graduating from law school, and some not so young who have been out of law school for some years. And it's really important for them to be integrated in the legal profession in all facets of the profession. For example, one of the issues that was discussed right before the Brackeen argument is that it has been years since a lawyer of Indian descent has argued a case in front of the Supreme Court. And part of it is that most of the lawyers who train and learn how to do that work within the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice has not really had Indian lawyers and not hired them specifically. So I think there really ought to be outreach efforts by all facets of our profession.
Right.
Hire young Indian lawyers and integrate them into all facets of the profession. I think that would be tremendously helpful.
That's a great point to make, and we'll need to follow up on that within the context of our section. And it's something that I think Indian lawyers would be excited about, particularly this coming year, as we inaugurate Mary Smith as our next ABA president.
No, exactly. And it's, I mean, if you just look at the judiciary, the federal bench,
right.
There are probably about a handful of people of Indian descent on the federal bench.
Right.
And I'm not sure there has ever been somebody of Indian descent on a federal court of appeals. I mean, there's really a gap in terms of people of Indian descent being represented throughout the judiciary. And so that's another facet of the problem.
Do you know the current number of, or roughly, the Native American lawyers in the country?
I don't. No, I'm sorry.
No, sorry.
But I know there are more and more.
Right, it's growing. Right.
Going through law school and passing the bar in a number of different states.
But I would imagine, given the numbers that I know are true in the African American community and the Hispanic community, I would guess less than 2% of our nation's lawyers are Native American.
Maybe even less than that. But I really don't know enough to even speculate in terms of.
I know in the Black community it's about 3 to 4%. So I would imagine it's less than that. Yeah, interesting. We'll definitely have to follow up on that point. So Jeff, as we wrap this chair chat up, we'd like to get to know our guest a little better personally. So I've got a few easy softball questions for you. First question is, what is the last book you read, or what book are you reading now?
Well, I'm a little bit on a history kick these days. So the last book that I read was, I reread actually, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And then I'm reading right now a book on the civil rights, or Civil War, I'm sorry, by Sheldon Foote.
Okay. So, good.
My roots are in history, actually. I could have become a professor of history at one point in my life, but decided to go in this direction. So
right. I love history. Well, that's my next question. If you could wake up tomorrow and be anything but a lawyer, would you be a history professor?
Probably. It would be between that and just somebody who travels around the world and writes about his travels.
Traveler. We have two things in common for sure. Several things, I'm sure, but I love to travel and I also love history. And my last question for you is, what do you do for fun?
I travel.
Where have you? What's the last place you've been?
Oh,
That
I
was,
spent a chunk of time in Sicily just a couple of months ago.
wow.
I've got and I like to travel using different ways to travel. So I've got a remote motorcycle trip planned in Baja California in January
Okay,
for a couple of weeks. So
that's exciting.
I like to travel all kinds of different ways.
Are you bilingual by chance?
I'm trilingual,
Charlie, what other language do you speak?
French and Spanish. My wife would tell you that it's not fluent, my Spanish, but I can defend myself.
You get to defend yourself. Good. That's good to know, Jeff. We really appreciate you sharing not only a bit about yourself, but your knowledge and your expertise on these important issues that are impacting the Native American community and our country at large. We thank you for your leadership and your service to the bar and to the ABA and to our section, and look forward to working with you in the future on these important issues.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Juan.
Great. Thank you for being with us today. Hope all of you have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday weekend, and we'll be sure to see you next week. Take care.